Bunty, thank you for a very generous introduction, and you tempted me by asking whether the panel or if I would like to ask the audience a question. And I have a question I'd like to put to the audience. Can any of you imagine a more brilliant, charming, more able director of the Asia Society in Bombay than Bunty Chan? Hands up, please. Bunty, thank you for your hospitality. This is not the first time you've honored me by inviting me and inviting my colleagues who are here on the stage with me and others in the audience, Nimi Patel, Robert Holmes. We all come from the law firm of Squire Patton Boggs, with the exception, of course, of our moderator, a large multinational law firm with about 2,000 attorneys in Europe, in North America, in the Far East. We are a true public policy firm. That is, our avocation is to try to make a difference for corporates and governments in dealing with regulation, dealing with legislation, to make the flow of business, commerce, and social issues a lot easier. That's what we do for a living, and I'm delighted that we're here in India and able to interact with as broad a range of audiences we've been able to do. Bunty, when you and I spoke, communicated from New York, I told you that I look forward to being with you and your audience this evening, and I accepted the challenge because I believe that we are all in extraordinary times, indeed challenging times, times that we'll look back and remember how we made our way through the conditions in the world today that we're currently undergoing. I say that from the vantage point of someone who served my country and my government for over 30 years and am pleased now in retirement to look back at what is happening on the global stage. And as I look at it, I can only come away with one firm conclusion, and that is the world that I knew and grew up in is changing very rapidly. The assumptions of global power are changing. Power is becoming diffuse. Nations are casting aside respect for long-standing rules of commerce, rules of international politics, the WTOs, the UN, and we're in a world in which nations, one after another, and particularly the great powers, are pursuing a much more narrow sense of national interest. This creates a variety of challenges that all of us have got to deal with. And it isn't just America first that Donald Trump is talking about, but across the globe, we're seeing assertions of national priority that is the dominant fact on the world scene. The United States is itself both a participant and has led in part to the situation we're in today. We stood astride the world and helped write its rules for many decades. That's no longer the case. We now share power. We don't dominate the world situation. And we've seen this happen for a variety of reasons, some of them quite explicable as nations have risen in their economic prosperity over the decades, their scientific capabilities, their abilities to compete on the global stage. We've also contributed to the problem ourselves, and Americans are quick to admit it, by the use of our national power in often profligate manners in Iraq and Afghanistan. But here we stand today, and we are looking at also an administration that regrettably has less predictability, has less consistency, has a more narrow view of America's interests and where we stand in the world than any administration I've served in my over 60 years of professional life and observation of American foreign policy. But I return to my core point, and the point that I hope will undergird our thinking and questions this evening, the diffusion of power. we are in a world in which new balances are being formed, new coalitions, new ways of thinking about how we can come together to deal with major challenges, climate change being the most pressing one, relations between China, Russia, the United States, India as another set of major challenges, crises in the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf and now in the last several days in northern Syria. These are all questions that we are coming at with new ways and very unsettling ways in most regards. And so when I look at the current disarray of the international system, I come back at least to one safety point, and that is despite the fact that we have had many disagreements between India and the United States over the decades, we are at a particularly strong and useful point in our relationship. It's much more than the commercial ties that bind us, and they are considerable. The exchanges of capital, technology, of commerce, all of which are very real. It's much more than the defense arrangements, the work of our armed forces that exercise together, or the trade and defense articles, or the meetings of our top military commanders. It's about more than the political dialogue that exists, including defense, national security, and intelligence dialogues. It's about more than that. It's about the fact that in a highly volatile and troubled world, there are two powers that seek stability and seek a democratic outcome to the problems that we all face in the world today. And I had the privilege of watching most recently the Prime Minister and his stay in the United States, and I was struck that the fact that we and India can look to the future. India will maintain its strategic autonomy. India will maintain well-oiled, to use Jaishankar's expression, relations with China and Russia. The United States will do the same. All of us will be acting with a degree of strategic autonomy. That's true. But at the heart, there will be a coherent set of sentiments and understandings that will be enormously important in these badly roiled times. And so I am today, as I've ever been, an optimist about the U.S.-India relationship. I believe that the relationship has produced some, but much more is to come. We will have our differences. We'll have our differences in trade. We'll have our differences over Afghanistan, over China, over Pakistan. But what we are learning to do and have managed to show ourselves through several administrations and on both sides of the aisle, that we can manage those differences. And that's the key change in the U.S.-India relationship. And so I conclude my introductory remarks with saying what I truly believe, and that is the best days of the U.S.-India relationship are still ahead of us. But this evening, we are joined by a number of distinguished professionals, as Bunty has introduced each one of them. And I don't want to get in the moderator's way of how he wants to deal, but each one, I think, will reflect in his own way about how we're managing this transition in world affairs that is besetting us at the moment. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was wonderful. It sets the context very well. Given the broad range of topics that you raised, I don't think we have enough time to discuss all of them. In the rest of the discussion, we will focus primarily on trade. And of course, as we discuss that, there will be, I think, other geopolitical issues that will crop up. I think, as Ambassador said, the certainties of global trade are now being challenged and questioned. So even big advocates like Krugman in the last couple of years have started questioning whether free trade is really good for everyone. And this discourse is starting to happen. There was a fascinating discussion between Secretary Ross and the Indian Minister Piyush Goyal, where Secretary Ross talked about why the US is going for bilateral pacts instead of multilateral pacts. One of the things that he said was that it takes a few months to negotiate, or it took a few months to negotiate the deals with Canada and Mexico and even Japan, whereas if it was a multilateral negotiation, it would have taken several years. So it's much faster, and especially as power equations are quite dynamic, as Ambassador said very nicely, the strategic autonomy that every economy will have. So let me start off by asking the Ambassador a question. When we think of trade relations, how much is dependent on what you would call the great man theory of history? Meaning, just because Mr. Trump wants imports from China to fall, will imports from China fall? In the sense that one of the projects we've done recently shows that even if a lot of business was to move out of China, there is no other country which can absorb it. I mean, everyone is talking Vietnam, but Vietnam adds like $5 billion of manufacturing GDP every year. Bangladesh can't do much more than apparel. India is struggling to get into apparel. So if exports out of China have to shift, where will they shift? Similarly, in the US-India context, the fact that Amazon has its largest office in Hyderabad because cheap engineers are not available everywhere. So this conflict that often arises, especially around elections, of H-1B visas, about Indian IT companies taking away jobs, how much is the discretion of the leadership, and how much of it is just big economic forces which are at play?
Well, first of all, let me make sure the microphone is carrying. Those in the back of the room, good, thanks so much. You need it louder?
No, loud and clear.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks so much. All right. I think if I follow the thrust of your question, Mr. Mishra, I share some of your skepticism that simply because the United States and China have entered into a protracted round of trade disputes, that the fundamental volume of trade between the United States and China is going to fall off precipitously. I don't believe that. First of all, there's the obvious fact that the President has blown the whistle on the approach we've taken to dealing with China. The latest rounds of tariffs will not take place, and there is a prospect of some relaxation in the time ahead. But I believe there will be effect on trade, and it will be more than simply the downturn in the global economy. China's exports will fall a bit. I believe, though, that the costs to the United States and the American consumer, more than the volume of trade, the cost will rise. And that is a fundamental flaw in the President's strategy. The second flaw, as I see it, I can't understand exactly where we want to end up with China. I don't see the strategy that we're trying to pursue. That said, I also recognize, and it's enormously important, that all of us understand the United States is in this position with China today for good cause. There are major issues that have developed and have not been properly attended to. Issues of technology transfer, issues of currency manipulation, issues related to state subsidies of exports from China. These are all questions, but one can manage these questions, and what I'd like to think we're going to end up with is a much more eat the mic. I'd like to think that we're going to end up with changes in the U.S.-China situation, but not one that is unmanageable. But my colleagues may have a different take. Thanks.
Yeah, Frank, would you?
Thank you. I agree with, first of all, can you hear me on this mic? Yes. All right, thank you. I agree with your premise that China trade is not going to be drastically affected. But I can tell you, we have numerous clients who are already starting to think about alternative supply chains. A number of years ago, Tom Friedman wrote the book The World is Flat, and his premise was that there's one seamless global supply chain. This is efficient. The world is getting smaller. And now we have Donald Trump and the China trade wars, and the world isn't flat. The world has to look at alternative supply chain arrangements, which provides an opportunity to India. I just came here from Egypt, where they're already thinking about an alternative supply chain. I've been advising the country of the Dominican Republic, a tiny island in the Caribbean, that has suddenly said, if China is not going to be the complete supply chain, why don't we offer production sharing incentives along the free trade zone so that we can supply from the Western Hemisphere additional product into America and at least bring jobs back into the Western Hemisphere? So I agree with you that the problems with China are not going to be resolved through this trade war, but there's so much uncertainty. When we have clients that call and say the stock market's up, the stock market's down, Trump's raising tariffs, Trump's not raising tariffs, we can deal with bad news. We can't deal with uncertainty. And the best way to respond to uncertainty is have an alternative plan. So it may not be a big percentage of that supply, but some of it will go to Bangladesh, to Vietnam. I would like to think India, Egypt, and maybe even the Caribbean.
Thank you, Frank. If I could actually continue with you, in the context of when you've done work on WTO and other multilateral pacts, what do you see as the role of these multilateral organizations? As Ambassador Wisner said, I mean, the UN, the WTO, I mean, the fact that India has import duty on handsets and Taiwan has challenged it in the WTO, does it even matter?
You raise probably the most fundamental issue with respect to world trade, and that is all of these trade agreements we've been talking about, not just the United States, but other countries, technically we should not be entering into. When we created the WTO, that was supposed to be the forum for reaching multilateral trade agreements. After World War II, we had the GATT, and the biggest problem was high tariffs, and all the countries got together and agreed on a common approach to reducing tariffs. That continued well until about the year 2000, when the Doha round collapsed for a variety of reasons. Trade increased, trade got more complicated, trade barriers increased. So what do countries do if you don't have the WTO? You go to a bilateral or regional trade agreement, and that's what's happened. The problem is none of those agreements are technically legal under the WTO. You have to get a waiver from the WTO for every one of these agreements, because the basis of a bilateral free trade agreement is to deny MFN treatment to every other country. That's not the way the system is supposed to work. Unfortunately, Mr. Trump is not a big fan of multilateral institutions, particularly the WTO. He has held hostage the appointment of new appellate judges in the WTO, so that when you're talking about new cases, we may not have enough judges to hear cases in the WTO. Problem number one. Problem number two is that there have been important trading countries, the EU, Japan, India, who have said, rather than walking away from the WTO, let's find a way to correct the fundamental infrastructure of the WTO in a way that allows us to address the biggest problems with China. Ambassador Wisner identified them: state-owned enterprises, government subsidies, other things that are not really captured in the current structure of the WTO. So in my view, rather than going in a bilateral tariff war, the better approach is, number one, an alliance of like-minded countries. I think we had something called the TPP, which the president withdrew from 3 days after entering office. And more importantly, long-term, is a fundamental reform of the WTO.
Yeah, so let me then bring in Congressman. Actually, before that, Ambassador, you thought that the Taiwan complaint on the WTO does matter. I mean, you can't really wish it away or ignore it. Do you think that the WTO can really enforce some of these disputes and resolutions for these disputes?
I remain convinced that, just as Frank Simola said, that the WTO is an essential framework for managing global trade. And the principle of most favored nations, MFN, is the core of its success. And that if you depart too radically from that, you will have a competitive situation in which we end up beggaring each other's neighbors. I am not, therefore, a fan of walking away from the WTO. There will be bilateral agreements. There is room for bilateral agreements. But I'd like to think that those bilateral agreements can be brought into sync with a generalized system in which most favored nation principles play out.
Thank you, Ambassador. So, Congressman Crowley, if I could bring you in here. There is this sort of stance that is emerging that the disrespect for multilateral organizations is somehow unique to Mr. Trump. Do you expect that if the Democrats were to come to power, we would see the return of the faith in G20 and UN and WTO?
Is this on the record? I'm teasing. It's a good question. The Democratic Party itself, in terms of generally writ large speaking, I think recognizes the need to engage in the world. And this is not unique to the president, but nor to American history, quite frankly. But in more recent years, looking at specifically from Nixon really on in terms of the China engagement up until Barack Obama, that we really have been engaged. And some would suggest, including the president, that we've been engaged as the police force of the world. And he wants to withdraw from that. Most recently, we saw that effect in Syria, much to the chagrin not only of many Democrats, but also Republicans as well. In terms of Democrats taking back control, we have control of the House of Representatives. And we know, I think we all know that there's something going on in the states right now, that there is an impeachment proceeding that's moving forward that has turned upside down in many respects what's happening in the body politic of America. All eyes will be on, I think, the debate that's taking place later this evening in the states, in the Democratic Party, in the quest to find, and I'm a Democrat, former Democratic member of the House of Representatives, to be clear, to find that candidate that can take on the president and have an opportunity to defeat the president. So it's a much more difficult question to ask because there's a lot to it. I would Frank reminds me in terms of the WTO that we most recently had the Boeing Airbus decision where there was a $7.9 billion decision, albeit I think it took way too long for that to go through. It was multi-year. Justice, sometimes the wheels of justice spin slow, but if there's a way, and I think certainly withholding judges is not going to help make that process any faster. But in answer to your question, I think I answered it pretty well, but Democrats tend to be more engaged than not. But it's no. By the way, in answer in looking at the question of replacing China with India or any of the above, just because the president enjoys bipartisan support in terms of his approach to China right now, and as the ambassador mentioned, specifically on the issue of not only the trade imbalance but currency manipulation, it doesn't mean that any other country would be immune from democratic or American criticism. If you go back to the days of outsourcing, I remember those days, the criticism that was pretty loud from the states in regard to that. So,
understood. I'll come back to the US-India relationship. Mr. Kirk, if I could, because this is also something that Brexit seems to be about, that the UK thinks that they will be able to better negotiate terms with other nations, other large trading blocs, that in 20 years' time, India and China will be the dominant economies, and being stuck with the EU is somehow, and that seemed to be sitting here, the basic premise. Is Brexit also about the move away from multilateralism? And what should we expect? I mean, now there's been so many moves that we've kind of lost context. So if you could even explain where we are now in the Brexit process.
How long have we got? Actually, I haven't got very long because I have to go and catch a flight. So if I get up and walk off the stage, it's not because of anything that any of my colleagues have said. I'm not going to try and explain the whole of Brexit to you, but let me just try very quickly to give a little bit of context and then answer your very important question. Chancellor Merkel is reported to have said to the British Prime Minister at the beginning of last week that it would be easier for Germany to leave the EU than the UK. And I believe that's true, and the heart of the problem of Brexit lies in Northern Ireland, and lies in the fact that 20 years ago, thank heavens, a process which had created enormous grief, violence and death was brought to an end in the Good Friday Agreement. The heart of the Good Friday Agreement is an arrangement which allows people who live in Northern Ireland and who believe in the union of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland, to see that evident in their lives, and people who live in Northern Ireland and believe in the unification of the island of Ireland, to see in their lives the ability to live in a whole island economy and society. And that was enormously helped and facilitated by the fact that the UK and the Republic of Ireland, and therefore Northern Ireland, existed in the same regulatory and customs space. Brexit obviously challenges that, and that is why it is so hard. I hope the High Commissioner will forgive me for pointing out that we have a new government which has been in office for less than 3 months. In that time, it's managed to lose every single vote in Parliament. It's taken its majority from +1 to -43. It's been judged to have acted unlawfully in advising the Queen to prorogue Parliament. The Prime Minister last week gave an undertaking to a court that he would obey the law that requires him to seek an extension of the 31st of October deadline if he hasn't got a deal, and at the same time said publicly that we would leave on the 31st of October, come what may. Those, I think, are illustrations of the difficulty of bringing off Brexit. There are serious negotiations happening at the moment. Whether they will allow the United Kingdom to leave on the 31st of October with a deal, I'm highly skeptical. I do, however, believe that the United Kingdom will leave the EU. I don't think the Brexit decision will be reversed. And I think the United Kingdom will leave the EU in an orderly and agreed way and not in a disruptive way. I believe the last part of that because the effect of that disruption on both the UK and the EU is very damaging, and not only economically in the short term but also strategically in the long term. And if it's in neither party's interests for it to happen, I believe a way will be found for it not to happen. The way is, however, very complicated. You'll be familiar with the paradox of Schrödinger's cat, the cat that is simultaneously dead and alive. Well, what we have to do in Brexit is create Schrödinger's province. Northern Ireland has to be simultaneously, legally, constitutionally, and fully part of the United Kingdom, and at the same time, practically part of the EU customs area. Describing that, there's a complex technical diplomatic term. I used to be a diplomat. Ambassador Wisner will, I'm sure, agree with me. The correct technical diplomatic term for what we're trying to do is fudge. Now, fudge is wonderful when it's in a little box on the table in front of you. It's rather harder to write down in a legally binding international treaty. And that is why I don't believe that Brexit will happen on the 31st of October. If there is an agreement that this fudge is a good recipe, actually writing the recipe down will be a complex process and that will take some weeks to achieve. So I think it's entirely possible that we will see at the end of this week or next week or just into the week after an agreement in principle as to how Brexit should operate. The mood music seems to be pointing in that direction. But I think actually getting from there to the point where everyone is satisfied that we have a legal basis to do Brexit will take a bit longer. Let me come on to answer your question. Is the UK walking away from multilateralism? Absolutely not. And there is no political party in the UK that is not a firm supporter of the rules-based international order. Brexit is not fundamentally about that. And I would say even that Brexit is not really about the economy or about trade, though those who promote Brexit promote the freedom of Britain to do trade deals which suit the British economy and not the European economy. Brexit is fundamentally about something that all developed economies suffer from, which is that there is a substantial proportion of the population who, from the early 1980s through to today, have seen no benefit at all from globalization. And that proportion of the population has been finding its voice since the financial crisis of 2008. They found it, I would say, in the United States, supporting Trump. They found it in the UK, supporting Brexit. They found it in virtually every European country, supporting populist parties of one kind or another, who can achieve in the high 40% in elections. And the challenge for the developed democracies and for the established political parties in the developed democracies is to tackle that problem. Trade policy may help do so, it may hinder doing so. I think the perception of moving labor and moving wealth away from the resident workforce is undoubtedly a perception that fed part of the Brexit vote. But paradoxically, the UK has the highest employment rate we've ever had. We have no structural unemployment, and the level of unemployment that there is extremely low. So, blaming outsourcing or the global supply chain is more of a psychological than a practical thing. I'd like just to end with one thought, if I may, because I have a profound belief that when we look back on this in 20 years' time, Brexit will be a blip. It'll be something that happened. I think there are two people who, none of whom have been mentioned yet this evening, who have brought about changes in the policy approach in many countries, arguably moving to globally, which will have far more impact and far more beneficial impact. And those two are a 93-year-old man from Britain called David Attenborough, who made an extraordinary television series about the impact of plastics on the oceans. And you're seeing an ever-increasing number of countries starting to tackle the issue of how we use plastics and how we use materials in our societies and our economies. And the second is a 16-year-old girl from Sweden who has caused a number of countries, and I'm very proud that Britain is the first major economy to have adopted a binding target to become a net zero carbon economy by 2050. I think many more will follow. Now, the changes those two bring about to our economies, to our ways of living, to our societies and so forth, I think are far more far-reaching than trade wars with China or Brexit or anything like that.
One quick question, follow-up, if I may. I mean, what are the probabilities, in the financial markets, we all want to quantify everything. What is the probability of a no-deal Brexit?
I have always believed it's very small. I think it could happen. It would happen, I think, by accident, not by design. While both the previous British government and the current British government say that, if there isn't a deal, you have to leave with no deal. Logically, that's right. If you're going to leave and there isn't a deal, you have to leave with no deal. But actually, I think when people in government look at the implications, short-term and long-term, of leaving with no deal, they tend to shy away from it and get back to the negotiating table. And I think you've seen that happen over the last couple of weeks.
Thank you.
But it's not impossible.
That should. Congressman Crawley, to continue the question that you mentioned, that the issues of currency manipulation, of the outsourcing issues. So we have seen many of the Democratic candidates, the presidential candidates, start voicing criticism of India's political moves recently, right? So some of the, on the Kashmir issue, some of the major candidates have actually spoken up. Given that, as the ambassador had also mentioned, that the negotiations or the terms with China are not just about trade, it's also about about power, it's about values, it's about the role of state-owned enterprises. How do you think in a democratic administration, the relationship with India, I mean, so because trade is only one part of a much bigger deal. So how do you see the relations evolving, given that there is already some criticism coming through?
Well, I think criticism is something that we're all used to in a democratic society. People are critical here, I know, and of their own government and of other governments, and I think that's the same in the States. I'll leave to Ambassador Wisner, because he does it so eloquently in terms of speaking about the U.S. and world reaction to Kashmir. But I think in terms of a democratic administration, there's going to be so much that the next president of the United States, the next democratic president of the United States will have to unravel or re-engage in on. You know, we're talking about the most important existential threat to all of us, and that is climate change. Reestablishing and reconnecting with the world on that issue alone is something that the next president will have to do in terms of re-engaging in the Paris Accord and beyond. I think there are many issues. You know, I was jokingly saying to Ambassador Wisner, he mentioned that there were two countries whose, I think, goal was to bring about stability in the world. I assumed that India was one, and I was wondering what the other one was. And that's how I think we feel in the States. We feel very unraveled, very disoriented in terms of what's happening with our own government. And I think adding to that the constitutional crisis that we're facing right now in the States as it pertains to impeachment. I will say this to all of you, and I sincerely believe this, that Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, did not want to go down the path of impeachment. It's because Speaker Pelosi does not believe that we should use impeachment willy-nilly, that it should be reserved for what it was meant to keep check and balance as the founders intended in our government. And she believes in the democratic path of voting, and that with elections comes consequences. And the consequences of how complicated our system may be, of having a president who is not popularly elected but done through the Electoral College, it's still the rules that we all live under. And she believes if the best way to change is through the electoral process. But a series of events that have been happening over the past few years, and I've said the straw that broke the camel's back in this particular case is the president's admission to his own testimony that he abrogated his responsibility, broke the law, and abrogated his responsibility as president and his duty to uphold the Constitution against enemies both foreign and domestic in trying to find information out about his political rival. And the best way to describe this in the simplest terms is that the wolf is not at the door with Ukraine, it's in the basement. And Ukraine is asking one of its friends to come over and help them get the wolf out, or at least keep it in the basement. And by the way, bring a gun. And the friend says, well, I'm on my way over, but before I come in, you have to do me a favor. You know, so when you're in that position, you're not in a position to say no to a favor. And so that's the quid pro quo that I think Pelosi recognized. And that's why we're moving forward. That's why I'm no longer there, the House Representatives moving forward with that procedure.
Ambassador, would you like to take a shot at the question as well? The fact that under a democratic administration, would we see different rules of engagement, and the fact that trade is only one part of a bigger engagement, and there could be other differences that crop up. In particular, what I've noticed is that around every presidential election, this issue of H-1B visas and quotas and dependent visas keeps coming up. Not much happens at the end of it, but do we see such rhetoric and discourse coming up?
From the general and go to the particular. Just over 9 months ago, Joe Biden, now a leading candidate for the presidency, attended the Munich Security Conference And he got up in front of it and he turned to many friends of the United States, European allies, and he said, listen, if the Democrats return to the White House, we'll go back to 2016. You know, I think I don't agree. I happen to like Joe Biden, but I don't agree with that statement. I don't think the world will ever go back to 2016. I don't believe that NATO will go back to 2016, which was the proximate cause of Biden's statement. That we are moving in terms of transatlantic security towards greater strategic autonomy for Europe. I don't believe we will go back to a world trading system that is purely defined by the WTO unchanged. We've got to adapt. I don't believe we're going to go back to a system in dealing with climate change without fundamental changes in the way governments react and interact with one another. In other words, we're in a time of institutional change and societal change, and there isn't any going back to 2016. Having said that, there will be a very different tone in a Democratic administration. In the United States, at the moment, a Democratic administration would lead to greater international cooperation, greater respect, greater willingness to build coalitions. But change, there's going to be. Now, will we be able to solve some of the thorny issues that you've just referred to? You mentioned H-1B visas, for example. That's right in the heart of an immigration debate. Joe Crowley reminded me recently, the last time I think we had a immigration reform was, 25, 30 years ago. It's because it's really, really, really difficult. And I don't think there's going to be an easy outcome, particularly as the Congress has already shown how sharply divided it is politically, but on this issue of immigration. And how do you balance the needs of an economy that needs high-end technology and the needs of people who are in the United States who really need to stay there, those we call dreamers. So I think these changes are going to be extremely painful. And I don't believe even in a Democratic administration they're going to change with the snap of a finger. Remember, in something like immigration, you've got to have not just the executive branch, but you've got to bring the Congress. Then you'll have to tell me, will both houses of Congress be in tune with the president? Even then, it would be difficult.
Understood. Thank you very much. Mr. Samonis, if I could bring you in at this stage, given that, see, one of the challenges, and I've been thinking a lot about trade the last year or so, is that it's very hard to draw hard boundaries. So when India signed free trade agreements with Japan and Korea, one of the fears was that Chinese steel was going into Japan and Korea, and Japanese and Korean steel was coming to India. Even now, a lot of the Chinese exports to Vietnam, it is alleged, are just relabeling of stuff before they are shipped back to the US. So if India does end up signing the RCEP and therefore has a free trade agreement with China, how does that affect the US-India trade negotiations?
In the first place, I would give very little possibility to RCEP actually being signed and agreed to, because I don't think you've got China and India talking. That tells me this agreement is going to be a long time in the making, let alone all the other countries. So I think RCEP, it could present problems if it is ultimately approved. But I think the problem is it's hard to find those boundaries. The problem is when you've got something like the TPP, which was a good representation to have an alliance of like-minded countries on trade, and the U.S. withdraws from it, that's not a good signal. And the other point I would add, getting back to the Democrat versus Republican on trade, if I could, the difference isn't so much, it's somewhat Democrat versus Republican, but it is as much, if not more, president versus the Congress, because this is a president who has acted in a unilateral fashion. He's used laws that haven't been used in a long time, 301, 232, and he's done them in a way that has left Congress sitting on the sidelines. So much so that this 232 law, which is premised on national security, has been the subject of new legislation by Republican senators. Senator Grassley of Ohio, Senator Grassley of Iowa, Portman of Ohio, who want to give Congress a say in the future use of 232. And remember, we've got an automobiles investigation that's about to be decided. This president has been able to act in a purely unilateral way without involving Congress. That is about to change. And I'd like to get Congressman Crowley's thoughts, because the free trade agreement that is to replace the NAFTA is one that does require congressional approval. Whatever you think of the President Trump's renegotiation, and I don't think much of it in terms of a difference between that and NAFTA, the fact is that the president has to get the votes of Congress. And that's the first time he has been confronted with a major trade issue for his priority that involves getting votes, not only from the Republican Senate, but from Nancy Pelosi's House of Representatives. So we're looking at a new dynamic, not so much Democrat-Republican, but it's Congress and the executive branch.
Can I just add a general point about trade and trade policy here, which I think there's a huge and obvious focus on tariffs when you look at trade negotiations. Some of the more difficult areas, however, are not about tariffs. They're about so-called non-tariff barriers, or if you look at it the other way, regulatory alignment, regulatory recognition, that kind of thing. And you've really got, in the world looking forward, and this is a reflection for my country, but it's a reflection for everyone, you've got three major poles of regulatory authority. You've got the US, you've got the EU, and you've got China. And I think every country has to decide at some point, which of those am I most leaning into? Which is my predominant trading relationship? Doesn't mean you can't have free trade agreements and trading relationships and all the rest of it with the others, but you need to decide which one you're leaning into. And frankly, I think the option of leaning into China is unlikely to commend itself to many countries for a whole host of reasons. So it actually comes down, if you have a free choice, and India is in the fortunate position of having a free choice, of leaning into the US or leaning into the EU, and then sorting out the relationship with the other in a way that's compatible. And that's quite a sophisticated and hard thing to do. At the core of that choice is the relationship between the EU and the US. And I think one of the most important things that could happen, I don't think it will happen under President Trump, but I may be wrong, but could happen over the next sort of 5 years or so, is a proper large-scale EU-US FTA, because I think that would enormously help countries like India, countries like my country, once we've left the EU, to navigate this regulatory alignment issue.
I would add to that, I think that President Trump has taken the issue of trade and turned it upside down on its head. And that is because Republicans typically have been viewed as the pro-trade party and Democrats not so much. I, for one, had a mixed record when it came to free trade agreements. I voted for some, but not for all of them. But I do recognize the need to have free trade agreements. The president made trade a very unpopular subject during the election, and then proceeded, as Frank Simonis had mentioned, in withdrawing from TPP 3 days after taking office, to the point that he's made it very difficult for many members of Congress from his own party to be in favor of trade agreements going forward. Not impossible, and if the president weighs in, as we know, if he tweets about one of them in a negative way, they can have a very, very drastic change of opinion on an issue. But I do think when it comes to particularly the UMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, I do think that there is bipartisan support for the agreement. And that is because these two countries, Canada and Mexico, are our two closest friends. They're our neighbors. They're our allies. And there is general trade balance within North America. And that's important. But we've come to rely upon, particularly when it comes to Mexico, as much as we all hear about the problems at our southern border, we've come to rely upon Mexico enormously. For 60% plus of our green food comes from south of the border. And that includes blueberries and strawberries and melons and avocados year-round. There was a time when we were growing up, you could only get blueberries in July. That's no longer the case. They're present, omnipresent. So that's how critical it is for the American way of life to continue as we know it. So I do think there is that, and I also think from a political standpoint, for many marginal Democrats, meaning Democrats who find themselves in districts that Donald Trump won, there is a need to demonstrate that they can work with the administration, or at least be able to work with Republicans to show that they're bipartisan. I think Speaker Pelosi recognizes that as well. I remind folks, if you didn't know, Speaker Pelosi voted for the original NAFTA. So she's not antithetical to trade. She believes in it as well. And so therefore, I think we'll see that. But I wouldn't necessarily take it beyond that there's going to be more coming down the road. I think Frank is right. I just don't see us re-engaging so quickly on TPP. I think to some degree to our disadvantage as well.
Mr. Samuel, is on this issue of non-tariff barriers. So, the second largest, in fact, the largest exports from India to the US are polished gems and pearls. The second largest is pharmaceuticals and generic pharmaceuticals. And so in the last decade, we've seen two big waves, actually last 6-7 years, two big waves of the FDA becoming really, really aggressive with compliance. So we had a wave 3-4 years back, and some of the recent inspections have also been very negative for the Indian producers. And I realized that I used to cover the sector for a while, that there are some factories, like lisinopril is a blood pressure drug. I mean, if that factory of Lupin shuts down, there will be a problem of drug availability in the US. And yet, we are seeing the FDA becoming really, really active. Now, how much of that is just a response to Bottle of Lies, that book that came out, I don't know if you've seen it, really creams the FDA on their inspections? And how much of that is actually kind of a non-tariff action?
Well, to begin with, you're right. There has been this enormous growth in non-tariff barriers. Ambassador Kirk is right as well. In the old days, after World War II, when we had the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the United States, the biggest priority by far was for everybody to reduce tariffs. And we did that in a series of stages. We did it on a multilateral basis. By the time we got around to about the mid-1970s and what's called the Tokyo round, suddenly the non-tariff barriers became much more important. The tariffs were not that much of an issue worldwide. The issues were standards. The issues were discrimination in government procurement. The issues were all sorts of things that didn't have to do with a specific tariff. That's point number one. Point number two is that the GATT or the WTO allow countries to act to protect their domestic health and safety in any way that they deem necessary, so long as they can demonstrate that there's a scientific basis, and so long as they are not discriminating against foreign imports versus domestic product. On the question of pharmaceuticals, I think the vast majority of Americans would like access. People are fed up with having to pay the highest prices for pharmaceuticals around the world. I don't think it is a nefarious conspiracy by the Trump administration. They may have others, but I don't think they've enlisted the FDA to pursue part of the trade.
Understood. And one response to Mr. Kirk, see this issue of the three standards of EU, US, and China. Actually, on drugs, the Chinese are saying if your drug is FDA qualified, you can sell in China.
Very interesting illustration of exactly my point. That actually, over time, and this, reinforces what Frank Simonis was saying about the importance of getting back to multilateralism in trade at some point. You do need that kind of interchangeability to come about for all of us to prosper.
Excellent. So that brings us to the end of the moderated question answer. Now we are going to open it up for audience questions. There are mics. Okay, so there are quite a few hands. Please keep the questions short and no comments, please.
China is a great example of what you said, a global, I think, strategic development, this BRI initiative. So I would like your comments on the growing influence of China with respect to BRI and also whether it's good for global trade or not. Any of the panelists.
Yeah, Ambassador Wisner, maybe you can.
Good. I think it's a very important question, much debated, much misunderstood. And so I'm going to express a personal bias. BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, is a fact. China has infused capital into the world trading routes, land and sea, and into the development of ports and facilities, into mineral production, industrial, the distribution of goods throughout, now pretty much throughout the globe, from Latin America to Western Europe. Is this good or bad? I personally believe that the world has a crying demand for infrastructure. There is not simply enough capital anywhere to meet that demand. And if China has the reserves and commits those funds in a responsible manner, we are wrong to oppose those use of investments on the face of it, provided that China respects core principles of international commerce, that environmental standards and labor protections are respected, and that China is careful about the management of debt burdens. To this point, the World Bank has done its analysis and informs us wisely that with the exception of one or two projects, the famous port in Sri Lanka, China has not abused the debt burdens of developing countries. And so I really think we and you in India should not reflexively say no to BRI. But what we should be doing is mobilizing our forces to mass capital to do the same or better, and to offer the world additional capital for infrastructure or competitive on better terms capital than Chinese capital, which, by the way, has some costs attached. I also believe that if China were to use her capital to extract political privileges, that we should be very clear that needs to be opposed, but not reflexively, to be very careful, but not to turn down Chinese investment on the global stage, but at least see if we could put together Europe, the United States, India, Japan. I can hardly think we couldn't mobilize the World Bank and other capital-emitting institutions to do the job that China now has a free hand to do on her own. Frank, I don't know if you agree with that, but...
I essentially do agree, Mr. Ambassador, but it's a perfect example of the kind of new development involving China that is not captured by the WTO. This whole notion of capital formation and preferential financing is beyond the purview of the current WTO. I'm not saying all of these practices are wrong. I think Ambassador Wisner is correct that there are probably a couple of bad examples. But even the bad examples on financing and capital flows and no strings attached loans, even if you have a complaint, the WTO is not the forum to bring it. That's what the EU and others are talking about, institutional reform. That's where we need to be focusing our efforts.
And if I may add a few things. See, the Chinese workforce is going to drop by 5 crores, 50 million over the next decade. So as commonly said, China needs a new China. So the Chinese demand, as the wealth keeps rising, their consumption keeps growing, their workforce is shrinking. So just in the last 4 years, their manufacturing workforce has dropped by 20 million. So they need cheap sources of labor. All the countries that are seeing a natural demographic addition to workforce are actually having very shoddy infrastructure, very poor governance structures, and therefore are unable to absorb the spillover from China. So I think it's partly in their interest and partly in our interest to actually drive those changes. Maybe the next question. There was one at the back here.
My name is Anand. Currency manipulation was mentioned. And for 30 years, the biggest currency manipulator has been the Federal Reserve, from Greenspan to the permanent tsunami of QE, it is straight money printing. Call it what you want. And I lived in the US for 15, 16 years, so I'm not that ignorant of the process. Now, Chairman Powell says it's not QE, but it's QE still. So it's not fair. You can get away with it because of the dollar's reserve status at the moment, but how long will that last?
I think, though, the nuance maybe with China, though, is the government infusing directly. Quantitative easing is not a direct infusion, and so I think that's it's not a fair necessarily playing field per se. And when you look at the trade imbalance that exists between the two countries, the United States and China, it's very disturbing, not only to this president, but it has been very disturbing to especially the manufacturing base that once existed in the United States, if it has been severely diminished over the last 40 years. So it's a combination of things. I mentioned that because that was something that was very much an issue during the Obama administration. Democrats in the House and Senate complaining to the Obama administration about it, wanting to see movement. And the Chinese did respond in many respects. My understanding, and I don't know the details, and Frank may have more insight in terms of this mini deal between the United States and China, but I'm understanding that currency manipulation is part of that as well.
The only thing I would add is that currency manipulation is somehow part of this mini deal with China. The problem with the mini deal is that the president has tweeted that it's phase one of a larger agreement. It will take the lawyers a good 5 weeks to come up with what they think everybody agreed to in phase one, let alone phase 2, 3, and 4. Something like currency manipulation is I am convinced, going to be pushed through phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, even though it may have been addressed in this first round. The problem is Trump does not want to say this is the completion of our agreement, so therefore he's creating different phases. But ultimately, like good negotiators, the Chinese are going to hold off on what their big concessions are, and number one or number two on that list would be currency manipulation. Even some of the agreements in this mini deal are subject to different interpretations. Trump tweeted, we've just got an agreement, the patriotic American farmers are going to now sell $40 billion more products to China. Thank you, China. That was his tweet.
The greatest mini deal ever on the face of the earth.
Yes. And the Chinese reaction was, well, we talked about additional purchases, but this all has to be in line with our national program for agricultural production. That's a relatively simple issue. You're either buying more or you're not. If the lawyers are fighting about that, God help us on currency manipulation.
Yeah, on that issue of currency manipulation, see, I don't know if you know, 80% of $100 notes in circulation are outside the US. So if you have that kind of currency strength and people trust the dollar, you can print as much as you want, I guess. Till the time you certainly can't. One question.
Yeah, so I have a question for Ambassador Wisner. I would like you to share your perspective on the future and this multipolar world by adding another dimension onto an already complex one of a multipolar trading system. When you add the lens of geopolitics to it, what emerges? Specifically, the question is, for how long do you think countries like India or groups like ASEAN, Singapore, can play the game of choosing one or the other between the security umbrella and the economic umbrella.
I expect you to ask a really difficult question, and so I'm going to satisfy you by giving you a really inadequate answer. I think we're in uncharted waters, and just exactly how this multipolar world of ours is going to play out is hard for me to define specifically. There is one time in history, and Matthew, you and I as Matthew's already left us. Matthew might agree with me. There is a time in history that I find there are analogies that are quite interesting. And that's the time of the Treaty of Westphalia, in which the modern system of states emerged in Europe. And the concept of a balance of power between states became an organizing principle for the maintenance of peace and security in the European continent. Now, there were two conditions in the Treaty of Westphalia that took, by the way, 30 years to negotiate. Those two conditions were respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. Under Westphalia, if your internal order, your religious dispensation was Catholic, the neighboring state didn't try, if it was Protestant, to change your internal religious order. That was the understanding in Westphalia. So respect for sovereignty and respect for territorial integrity, and leaving nations the right to define their own social systems. In some manner, the world order that I see emerging is one in which there will be individual nations defining their own paths, and at the same time respecting the boundaries of the nations that they live next to. If not, we're going to be in a world of chaos. But precisely Westphalia, it took a war that lasted 30 years for people to come to their senses. But once they did, they produced a system that maintained the peace in Europe, more or less, until the Napoleonic period and the arrival of an imperial system and the revolution of the French. But I think that model strikes me as one that has some attraction to the way I see nations balancing power and learning rules of respect.
Hello. Yes, so there was a question there. Yes.
Hello.
One second. He's been raising his hand for a while. So
Hello. My name is Raman. I have a question about India and US trade relationship. As we can see, China and US are kind of facing trade war. How do you think India replacing China after a few years and US will not start a trade war with India?
So if it is all about deficits, then you start with China, then you see a larger deficit with Vietnam and you say, oh, Vietnam, now I'm going to go after you. And if that business moves to India, then the next in line is India.
That's, as I said, it's probably inevitable that no matter where it moves, in terms of the U.S. populace that cares about these issues, industry, the people who work in those industries, they're going to look for the next demon. It's natural.
But I think it does underscore, just to add a footnote, the fallacy of the Trump administration when it judges existing trade agreements as good or bad, depending on whether or not the United States has a surplus or a deficit. And under the Trump mind frame that likes tariffs and hard things to identify with, if we are running a trade deficit with any country, it necessarily means the United States is getting ripped off again. Somebody's picking our pocket. and Trump is going to fix it. Well, the World Trading System, most economists violently disagree, first of all, with that analysis, because you can't simply look at one statistic like a trade deficit or a surplus to conclude that the agreement is good or bad for America.
I'm a geologist. I'm Arijit. My question is not on trade. It's about climate change. We geologists know that the whatever the calamity is being talked about, the sea level rise, etc., it happened in India, in US, so many basins where we have got saline water deposits from which we are extracting oil. Okay. Now the question is that the forces which has been sun and ocean currents, which had affected these changes in global climate change, have they taken leave because the humans appeared? I think we need to think about that. Second thing is that since these sun and ocean currents are major drivers, are we trying to discipline themselves? Do we have the powers and resource to do that? And is it a simple megalomania? We are going to lose money there. Thank you.
Well, you posed an interesting question, but I'm going to come back and say, to me, the challenge of the moment is to intensify the scientific examination of climate change, but you cannot stop there. You can't stop with just finding out solar current patterns. That's not enough. We have to take urgent action. And our friend Matthew Kirk made 2 points. The pollution of our oceans with plastics is unacceptable. The young Swede talks about less use of fossil fuel and the accretion of greenhouse gases. All of these issues, I think, are now generally accepted as serious challenges to human life on this planet. And we've got to deal with it while we are understanding the deeper science that lies behind the moves in climate change. I refuse to be, therefore, a climate denier. And I am a strong advocate of international cooperation to deal with issues of climate change, of management of resources, of pollution. I believe the world will only survive if we act together. And so I believe diplomacy and science play a hand together for genuinely the betterment of mankind.
As not a scientist nor expert in this, but I too am not a climate denier. That's not to say that there aren't natural things happening that contribute to it, but that the contribution of mankind towards the pollution is undeniable. And even if, quite frankly, plastics in the ocean were not contributing to climate change, is it a good thing to do? Should we not be about trying to introduce less pollutants into the world anyway, to Mother Earth and all that she gives to us? And that's very basic and simple, but to me, that's as important as it is, maybe as important as whether we survive as a planet anyway.
I agree there, but the point is that we should not mix pollution fight with climate change. They are two different issues. The problem is that plastic is a separate issue and other pollution.
Yes, Arjit, thanks. We got your point. I think after this also we will sort of hang around a bit. There is a question from, sir, I'll come to you later. So there is a question right back.
Hi, my name is Jay and I'm a student. I have 2 questions for the panel. The first one being, what do you think is the importance of China in the Panama region? The fact that the Chinese and the Panama have more than 30 bilateral agreements. It owns around 4 out of 5 ports in Panama. and Xi being the first president to visit Panama. So the first question is, what do you think is the importance of Chinese in the Panama region? And the second, in a hypothetical scenario, if Trump gets re-elected and things go south between China and US and China and Trump, so what do you think, where will the world go?
Well, first, when it comes to the issue of Panama, I don't think the United States, nor any, quite frankly, other within the region will tolerate any interference in terms of the free flow of trade through the canal. I don't think I'm out of line in suggesting that. I think I'm not going to invoke the Monroe Doctrine, but I'll invoke the Monroe Doctrine, that it's in our interest to make sure that those trade routes are free from encumbrance. So in terms of the re-election of the president, I'm not going to go there.
So in the interest of time, two last questions, one from the lady here and the
Good
gentleman
evening.
there.
Basically, again, back to climate change. And just this morning, I was reading this piece of news which said that Germany is finally closing down 84 coal plants. And having said that, the end to this entire episode was, again, President Trump not delivering on the promises at the sustainability, which has led to almost 1,000 global institutions pledging to divest from gas, coal, oil, which totals around 3 trillion in total. So basically that has severe implications in terms of US and the balance of trade. So can you throw a little bit of light on that? Because for Germany itself, which has, say, half of the coal, it is about 45 million to mitigate losses in coal regions. And that, of course, is coming from renewable sources. Again, a huge trade implication there.
See, one of the things about the German renewable investment, I was part of an energy panel some time back. The issue is that the amount of carbon they've emitted in setting up the renewable infrastructure, it will take 15, 20 years of the operation of this renewable energy to actually compensate for that. So the creation of solar panels, so actually the kind of solutions the Germans have come up with, I mean, I think they have taken build scale, and I think that's taken us all forward. But I'm not really sure if that is really the model that everyone should be copying and we can afford to do that.
I'm not sure I can answer the question either, but I will say that under the present administration, there has been a retrenchment when it comes to renewable energies and investment in them in the United States. Under the Obama administration, through the tax code and changing behavior to the code, there was more than attempts. It was in law, and there's been a withdrawal in many respects, and that has great concern back in the States.
And one final question from the gentleman there. Sir, please. Yeah.
Whenever an Indian Prime Minister goes to USA or American President comes to India, we are very happy to hear that the oldest democracy and the largest democracy is partnership. How is that partnership doesn't appear so realistic or binding once the visit is over? Are we Indians so gullible that we really believe that ours is a very strong partnership, but the experience is otherwise?
You know, I'm really glad that you brought us back to ground reality and a reflection on our most basic principles. We rather blithely slip into expressions like the two oldest democracies. But I think if I reflected from an American point of view, there is substantial concern in my country about the functioning of the democratic system. That functioning is about the independence of our press, the degree of tolerance in the society, the functioning of democratic institutions, the ability of people to build coalitions across parties to improve governance, the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary. All these questions weigh on us, and we're worried about it. We debate it. We think about it. And I have a sense, though I don't have the privilege of living in India, that you all are facing similar doubts about the functioning of democratic principles and how they are playing out in your system of press, judiciary. But that's for you to think about. All I can say is that the democratic world, of which I'm proud to be part of, and I know you are as well, have a big job ahead. A job not only to strengthen our institutions, but to transmit the values on which those institutions are based to our children and grandchildren, and make them relevant to the tangible needs of ordinary citizens, not only to young people, but to those who need to change their material circumstances. So the fight for democracy is not one that is over. It's really beginning again, and it needs to work here in this country and in the United States.
I'm not going to beat that. But I would just say that prime ministers come and go, presidents come and go, and but I think the fundamentals are there in terms of the relationship. We've been here for the better part of a week, and we've heard each other talk about the things that join the United States and India together: the rule of law, civil society, and common law that we both inherited through Matthew, through the British jurisprudence system. We got the better and the lesser from the two system, from the system. And those are important, I think, in terms of, I've always asked myself the question, in terms of our relationships, we do so much with China. Why not with democratic India? Why not with a country that has a mature political system, albeit, goes through the throes like we are as well, but has sustained democracy through assassinations, as we have as well. And that's a sign of a mature democracy, that there's a peaceful transfer of power. I think there's some question, concern whether there will be peaceful transfer of power, and I kid not, in the United States. That is growing more and more. But I think it is those fundamental beliefs that we share. And it's not just that you find yourself in a certain part of the world, but it's also because you find yourself in a certain part of the world. The relationship is that valuable. It's why I supported, as a Democrat, under a Republican administration, the civilian nuclear transfer deal. I was sent here by that administration to prove that it was, in fact, a bipartisan agreement, that we agreed in principle that we wanted to bring India under the Non-Proliferation Treaty umbrella, even though she could not enter into it itself. And that's the kind of America I want to get back to. I had an incredibly positive and strong relationship with then President Bush, a man of a different party, but whom I was able to work with and get things done and accomplish. I don't see that relationship in the same way under this president as we did then, but this will change too at some point. That's the beauty of democracy.
Well, on that note, and a very positive one, so thank you for being such a wonderful audience, but most importantly, thank you, Ambassador Wisner, Congressman Crowley, Mr. Samolis, and Mr. Kirk in absentia for a riveting discussion, a very educative one. I think we should all stand up and give them a great applause. Thank you.